Okay.
Zoom in.
So, maxillary cast, classification 2, mod 1. When I'm thinking about a classification 2 mod 1, I know on the distal extension side, I'm going to try to use an I-bar. That means I'm going to use an RPI. If I can't use an RPI because one of the 4 or so indications that I mentioned in class, which means that we have a high frenum attachment, it means we have a large soft tissue undercut, it means we don't have a mid-buccal undercut, it means that we have a large bony exostosis, or we have a high frenum attachment.
The wrong incline, right? The incline, like if the teeth go out instead of in.
If the tooth came out instead of in, yeah, it could be. Then I might think about RPA. I've had a lot of questions about whether an I-bar can be used in other situations. When you're on the distal extension side, we call it an RPI. That means mesial rest, distal guide plane, and an I-bar. An RPA means a mesial rest, a distal guide plane, and an Akers clasp. That doesn't mean that we're not going to use an Akers clasp or an I-bar in other situations. We will. We just don't call it RPI, and we don't call it RPA. We call it an I-bar, or we call it an Akers clasp. In a distal extension side, we have to use an infrabulge clasp. Anytime you use an I-bar, it's an infrabulge clasp. Anytime you use an Akers clasp, it is not necessarily infrabulge. It's only infrabulge when you add it to the RP, and you call it an RPA. On this side over here, I'm thinking about a mesial. I want to rest on either side of my modification space. On both sides of my modification space, I'm going to want to rest. So I'm going to use a distal rest on the premolar. I'm going to use a mesial rest on the molar. I'm going to put a clasp onto this posterior tooth because the mesial rest on the molar becomes part of my fulcrum line. The mesial rest on this premolar becomes the other end of my fulcrum line. So my fulcrum line is going across here. So here's my fulcrum line. Okay? Mesial of the premolar to the mesial of the molar. I'm going to put a rest anterior to this space also. It's not far enough to count as my indirect retainer, and it's too far away from my other rest over here, so I'm still going to put an indirect retainer on the cingulum of this canine. But when I'm determining my tilt for all of that, the things that I need to take into account is I need to find a distal guide plane. I need to find a distal guide plane, and I need to find a mesial guide plane. And I need a distal buccal undercut on the molar for my clasp, and I need a mid-buccal undercut on the premolar. So I'm looking for that tilt that's going to give me the best. So the first I'm going to do is the anterior-posterior tilt, looking for the guide planes. I'm going to concentrate on this side because it's this closed space that's more than likely going to cause me the problems. I have a large undercut on the molar. I have a fairly large undercut on the molar that isn't going to show real well, is it?
There you go.
Is that coming up? Okay. So I have a fairly large undercut on the molar. Quite a bit of space in here. When I go to the premolar, I'm good. I don't have any. I kind of want to split the difference in case I have to adjust, but I know the molar's a bigger tooth and I can adjust more on it if I need to. So I'm going to tip it back and I'm going to look. Still have quite a bit. Beginning to pick up some. I'm not, yes.
In line. Yeah. The molar.
You can do that as long as it doesn't appear that you're going to have to take off too much. Otherwise, I tend to like to split the difference.
Yeah, it was a lot off the molar if you did it that way.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. When I look at the other premolar, no matter what tilt I have, I tend to be okay on the other premolar. So when I look here now, I still have some adjusting to do on the molar. Not too awful much though. And I would have to adjust a little bit on this premolar. Part of the problem with the premolar is that the contact is right up at the marginal ridge. And I want a little bit of that 2 to 4 millimeters or so of flat surface to contact. So I'm still going to have to adjust on the premolar just a touch. Many of you are making a mistake on your guide planes. The guide plane has to go to the height of contour or above. All right? So when you draw it, you want to draw it almost to the marginal ridge. You shouldn't be falling very short of the marginal ridge. When you draw me your little red square, your little red rectangle, it should go almost to the marginal ridge, and it should come down about 3 millimeters or so would be a nice average. Okay? Somewhere between 2 and 4 millimeters down the side of that too. Then from there on down to the gingiva, you want a little bit of space. If you don't have space, the lab's going to block out and make space anyway. You want a little movement of that framework there. When you then, after you draw your red square, don't forget to come up one side of it, across the top by the marginal ridge, and back down. It has to be incorporated into the framework. So when you look here, maybe, if I can get it into the picture, where did I go? Find me, I'm lost.
There you go.
Who do I say? Saint somebody? Saint Christopher finds you what you're lost?
Saint Epi.
Saint Epi.
Got you.
I don't know. I've lost a lot over the years. Okay, so this has been hash marked to indicate that it's going to be adjusted, and that's fine. It's the right size. You see it comes up pretty much to the marginal ridge. It's got a little space down here at the gingiva where it's not colored in red, but your framework comes up, goes around the rest, and comes back down, including that guide plane, therefore, in the framework. For some reason, this framework was done in brown. I told you in our lecture, different schools use different colors, so and most of the faculty here have taught in a variety of different schools. So whether this was done with Dr. Reisbick or somebody who had colors from another school, I don't really know. Over here, we have the red guide plane marked, and the framework comes over and above the guide plane to include it as part of the framework, and then it drops down. And that is the correct way to do it. Many of you on today's exam did not include that guide plane. You drew it, but then you didn't include it as part of the framework. All right? So after we've established the tilt, I'm proud to say that every single one that I graded did not miss putting the tripod marks on the cast. Absolutely none of them that I graded missed marking the height of contour. None of them missed marking the rests. None of them missed any of those first grade steps, which is really good because I don't think that's ever happened when I've graded this before. So you all remembered those steps, and that means you had your rubric out and you looked at it, and so to me that's good. So let's take a look at this. Mesial rest, distal guide plane, an I-bar. Somebody's dropped it, so the I-bar is missing now. Keep in mind that the I-bar should come up to around the mid-buckle. Never distal to the height of contour. Mid-buckle is ideal. Your I-bar should be about 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters in wide and consistently the same width, just for the niceness of knowing how to draw it. Once you enclose your red undercut mark, you should continue on so that the tip touches the height of contour before it drops back down. I did see that on a number of cases today when we graded, where you encircled the red undercut mark, but then you stopped. You didn't go ahead and go on up to the height of contour before coming back down. In this one, you'll come back down. You're going to come back with your open lattice. You want your acrylic, however, to go all the way back to the hamular notch. You're going to come around and make sure that you're indicating your acrylic just below the open lattice. Some of you, and let me not point anyone out, but let me just grab this one for a second. This is incorrectly drawn. The acrylic is coming down and into the opening of the AP strap. When a framework is made and you've indicated you want open lattice, there is a recess created right here. The metal is thinner where the acrylic's going to go than it is where the major connector is. That's why this lattice work is a minor connector. It's not major. And if you cross the major connector with your acrylic into this hole, this metal is going to be thinned, and you've now lost the integrity of your major connector because the metal is going to be thinner there and it's not going to be as strong. I'm going to come across the posterior region, and I'm going to come up to what has been used as reciprocation on this molar. Reciprocation can be achieved by a circumferential clasp that is above the height of contour, or it can be achieved by a lingual plate. Either one needs to go clear back to this distal buccal corner. You want 180-degree encirclement of this tooth when you're done. So the plate should be at or above the height of contour and should go back to the distal buccal cusp. Keep in mind also, the functional cusps for the maxilla are the lingual cusps. So whatever you put here has to be low enough to not interfere with the occlusion. If you give me a lingual plate that comes right up here to the cusp tips because you're trying to get over top of the survey line, it's not acceptable because the patient's never going to be able to bite down. In a case like that, you might have to indicate you wanted to lower your height of contour by doing some enameloplasty. How do we lower a height of contour? If you have a tooth, can we switch back to this, Mr. Chris? Okay. If we have a tooth and we survey it out and our height of contour is clear up here, and I need to put a clasp there, so I need my height of contour down here. I'm going to first draw the height of contour where I would like it to be. I'm then going to indicate that from the one that is wrong down to here, I want to change it. So I draw it where I want it, I indicate where I want it, I indicate where it is, and I indicate with the hash marks that I want to lower it. Then when I'm drawing my clasp, let's say reciprocal arm, which should be in blue, but since I'm mixing up all the colors today, let's say it was the reciprocal arm. I'm going to draw the reciprocal arm right over top of it. And that's telling us that I'm going to lower the height of contour through enameloplasty here, and then I'm going to be able to put my clasp where I want it to be. So that's how you indicate a change. So if I continue on with this design, my plate comes around, I'm going to come up and into my rest. Therefore, my metal is now encompassing the guide plate. I'm going to drop down. I'm going to put my retentive arm out here. I've got a difference in retentive arms. When you're using a circumferential clasp, my undercut is marked here, and it goes at the bottom, the inferior part of the clasp. So on this piece of paper, there we go, the undercut is marked here, okay? And the bottom of the clasp is just touching it and it goes back up. It's not like the eye bar where it encloses it. If I put it, because this is on a horizontal surface and the eye bar is on the vertical surface, it does a whole different thing if you enclose that undercut mark there. Because if you enclose it there, this part of the clasp right here would be 0.01 inches below the survey line. This part of the clasp is in 0.01, 2, 3, or 4, somewhere in there. This is in more of an undercut than you want it to be. So with the circumferential clasp, the undercut mark goes right at the bottom on the retentive side. Remember coloring in a framework too. I saw that someplace today. Coloring in a framework is something we do in the drawings on the lab slip. It's not something that we do on the cast. So you don't really want to color in your framework. If you look at any of our examples, none of them have been colored in. Okay, so now we got to talk about this space, because we've got our circumferential clasp, and we come back and we drop down, and we're going to come with this kind of arced circle around the facial of the cast. We're going to come back up into our occlusal rest. We're going to come around and we're going to drop back down. We are going to plate this so we can come across with the plate. We can come across here with the plate. We're going to come up and we're going to enclose our indirect retainer. Let's talk about that for a few minutes. When you go over top of a cingulum rest, on the lower, you should have scalloped that rest just the same as you scallop the plate around the other anterior teeth. The red portion of the cingulum should be underneath the metal, so it should be below the blue. Some of you put the blue down below and left the red up above it. The red is no longer incorporated into your framework. Just like putting a locator, where you put the male portion of the locator in the denture and the female portion in the implant, this is the same way. This recess, this cingulum rest, is a female portion, if you will. Inside, underneath the metal plate, is the male portion. When you take the partial off and you look inside of it, there's a little bleb inside of there that fits into that recess. So it has to be part of the metal framework. We don't loop over it in general like this is drawn here, except in the maxilla. And the reason we do it in the maxilla is because there's an opposing occlusion that's going to fit in here, and when those two teeth come together, if you have taken that metal plate all the way up close to the incisal edge, there's not going to be enough clearance and you're going to have to grind it off. And so it's kind of okay to loop it around like this when you're dealing with the maxilla so that it doesn't interfere with the occlusion. We come on across, come around, and we're back into our rest again that we had on the other side. So our framework is continuous. You should look at the frameworks in this way. You should start at one spot and you should trace it and see if you can go all the way around without saying, uh-oh, I'm lost. Where's the road map? Okay? It should follow all the way through. Talk about this tooth over here. When you look at the metal for that tooth over here, it's recessed. It's a minor connector. So you have to show where it's going to end with the framework, which is on this cast is the brown. Okay, you should show where it ends with on the inside of the framework. It should have a finish line across here. And it should have a finish line which is brown here on the outside. Okay, I'm going to move to this drawing because Dr. Smith and I disagreed, and part of that is just our difference in training. So one way is to draw a tube tooth, and a tube tooth is indicated this way. We have our buccal finish line, we have our lingual finish line. Okay, this is just showing in between where our guide plate's then going to come up off of here. We're going to mark it TT for tube tooth. We're going to put a hollow circle in the middle. That means tube tooth. And if we want to put some acrylic, we're going to keep the acrylic inside the blue. And that brown, which is indicating acrylic, is really indicating our tooth. Because when the lab fabricates your metal framework, cast as part of the framework is this little nub that doesn't show great on here, but this little nub that's sticking up right here. Where'd it go? Right in here. And that little nub sticking up, they will then take a denture tooth, hollow out the inside of it, and glue it into place for you. And you will still have a metal band out here that goes around that tooth, and this metal band on the inside that goes around the tooth, and the tooth will actually be glued into that space. It looks like the tooth is coming right out of the metal. There really, on a tube tooth, is generally not any acrylic. You would have to specially order that you want acrylic there if you're wanting it. Dr. Smith has this all thinned out because he took acrylic and would put it down here and make a little acrylic flange. Tooth bound, he wouldn't extend it to the vestibule, but he would put some acrylic there. In normal circumstances, the tube tooth does not have any acrylic there. You would have to special order that and have to tell your lab that you needed acrylic there because you were using tube tooth in an aesthetic situation, and for some reason you wanted to cover that metal and have acrylic there. The other choice that you have for this place is the braided post. I'm not very good at finding my location. There we go. A braided post, we're going to say this is the buccal and this is the lingual. We've got the acrylic of a tooth sitting in there. We have the dot in the middle is solid, and I've got all this little pepper specks around it. What that actually is going to be is the metal of the framework, just like I showed you here. But instead of having that one post up the middle, it's going to have lots of little teeny nodules that are cast as part of the framework, and it will have a braided post in the middle, and the tooth will be adhered to all of those little speckles by a little acrylic, but the acrylic is still going to be within the metal framework. Again, doesn't really have an acrylic flange. If you want an acrylic flange, you're going to have to order it. Third choice is to put a dummy tooth in there. A dummy tooth is metal. It's going to be a tooth. It's basically going to fill this whole area when they cast the framework with part of the framework. It will have an occlusal surface on it that would meet with the opposing occlusion. The best I can tell you is to color it in your drawings in solid blue, indicating that it is all metal, and write that you want a metal occlusal or a dummy tooth. In order to get that from the lab, you're going to have to give them mounted casts. You can't just send them the lower and say, make me a framework, because they're going to have it mounted and make it in occlusion for you at the time that they make the framework. Works fantastic in a non-aesthetic area. Okay?
Is the dummy tooth attached to the guide plates on each side?
It's all cast as part of that framework. So it would be, it would be part of your guide plates, yes.
So how do you draw that? Do you draw the guide plates extending down to the circle?
You're going to draw it the exact same way that you draw the guide plates, but when you fill in, when you're drawing your drawing, look at this one. When you draw your drawing, you would do exactly the same as everything, except you would just take and color this all in as a blue cube.
Okay.
Okay? So instead of having beads, instead of having a post, you would still have the internal finish line. You're still going to have the external finish line. I'll rephrase those there because we use the term internal and external in a different way for finish lines. But when you create this finish line and when you create this finish line, you would just color in between the two in a solid blue, and then you would indicate that you wanted a metal occlusal. Then when they cast your framework, there is just a chunk of metal that is part of the whole entire framework. The mesial of that chunk of metal is your guide plate. The distal of it is your guide plate, and it would just slide right in between those as your framework goes to place.
Which one is the most retentive out of the three?
Out of the three, the most retentive for keeping the partial down, these aren't going to play a role in it. But as far as which one's going to give you the longevity to hold the tooth into place, obviously the metal tooth is going to be best. Because it's part of the framework, it's not going to break off. Either one of these other choices in a situation where the space is that narrow is probably going to not stay retained. It's probably going to break off of there. And we've all had that happen. And it's typically just because there's not enough space there to retain the tooth. You can't get it to adhere enough. Are there any questions?
The dimensions.
8 millimeters all the way around. Yes.
So when you're marking on the design sheet, how do you do
How do you write?
When you're working on the design sheet,
Here.
how do I mark the?
Cover that. He's just using it to show. Oh, I think that was wrong. That was wrong on the first one.
Oh, that's all right. I'm looking at it to see what she's talking about. How do I mark what?
Lingual plate up
Where do
top
you
right
write it?
here.
Under major connector, are you asking how I mark AP palatal strap?
I think he's saying no,
I think she just has to write AP palatal strap instead of. I think she's.
Come up for a minute. I'm not getting it.
Talking about the
Plate
lingual.
on two, on the lingual,
I guess the two.
being plated instead of a.
But that is the strap though.
Instead of a reciprocal.
But you name it.
Okay.
If I write on
Using a
retention.
plate as a reciprocal.
Okay, so if you're talking about that lingual plate on tooth number 2, okay, you would simply say under major connector that you're going to have an AP palatal strap, okay, and then that lingual plate on number 2 serves as reciprocation, and since we don't ask you to specifically identify where you're putting reciprocation, it would just be indicated through your drawing. There's no place that you actually have to write it because it's not retention. It's above the height of contour, so you can't put it under retention. It's not a guide plate because it's not interproximal. It's not a rest, and it's not acrylic retention. So you really can't put it any place. If I was going to do it, though, and indicate the plate, what I might put under design alternatives is reciprocating clasp arm instead of plate. I might use that as one of my alternatives. But otherwise it just comes from the drawing. Anything else? Doing your exam in here, and then while we're grading the exam, you'll be taking the written test. So yeah, go by your manual.
Not good.
You will have, let me give you another tip for those of you that maybe, since Dr. Rozuki made it very clear that this 100 point is still guided with our help and is not treated like an examination. It will tell you in the manual which test you're doing on Monday, or which cast you're doing on Monday morning. So if you guys haven't figured it out yet, if you look in the schedule, it tells you which cast you're doing on Monday morning, and then if you look at the cast page, the image page, it will show you the cast that we're going to do on Monday morning. So you certainly can think about it ahead of time, which isn't cheating because we put it in the manual, and it's not cheating because we're allowed to help you. So it certainly would make it worthwhile for you to look at it ahead of time and make sure that you know the variations between today's design and that design, which should be fairly close, but you can look and see the cast. All right? Okay.
What was the framework that we did today? Oh, is that it?